Uh, Today, what we're going to talk about is a little bit about grazing management and how we can use that in conjunction with some of our other uh, range management tools and just some basics about what it is we're doing. A lot of people think about grazing management as stocking rate, but there can be a lot more to it if we really want to make more of a better use of that tool. So what I want to do, uh, I got what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is to discuss things that affect how defoliation from either animals or fire affects plants and plant communities, and then talk about some of the processes and patterns that we have to manage with the grazing animal to get desired effects in the vegetation and the animals, and then talk about some limitations of continuous grazing and how we can achieve different goals with grazing management, including how we can facilitate things like prescribed fire and herbicides using them. When we're managing anything, we need to have a goal for what we're doing. Quite often, I've had people ask me about various things with regard to grazing or any kind of range management. What should I plant? What herbicide should I use? My first question to them is, well, what do you want? And unless you know, there's no, I mean, do whatever you feel like, because one thing is as good as another. And so one valid goal to me is to decrease risk that we have associated with drought or forage productivity. Uh, we can do this by managing the water that falls, and we do that by managing the amount of cover that we have, and that will affect evaporative losses. That affects how much water soaks in. It affects how deep it will go, and it affects how long we have moisture there. And so all of those things, in addition to if we've got a stockpile of forage out in front of us, that can always get us through at least short periods of dry weather. This is an example of what I'm talking about. These are the exact same ecological sites, same soil, same everything. They're about 60 miles apart in the same year. The guy on the lower right corner, he is managing water more effectively. He has the cover there. He has, this is down in a little swale. I mean, it's a little hard to tell because this is up on the plains, but water tends to go there. The guy in the upper left, there's nothing there to hold it, and even what manages to soak in, we've got so much bare ground that a lot of it evaporates out before anything good can happen. The interesting thing about those two places is the guy in the lower right is running a lot more animals per acre than the guy in the upper left. And it's because he's taking it to about that level and then getting off and letting the plants regrow and then coming back. Another goal that we can have is to change diet quality or intake or performance or the carrying capacity of the land. Quite often we've got animals that are capable of performing much better than what they can with the forage quality that we have. And we know that performance is a function of forage quantity and forage quality. And so what I'm illustrating with those two little pictures, quite often we may have that a cow that's like that big combine, and the forage resource we've got could be harvested with that pair of mules over on the left. And until we match those up, we're going to be fighting nature and spending a lot of money to get that done. Another thing that we can do with grazing management is get more effective use of the forage resource. We can, in some instances, get animals to places that they used to not go. And in effect, we've increased the number of grazable acres by doing that. We can also affect how much the animal is allowed to select forages of varying qualities and the time over which that they do that. And so the analogy I like to use is, so, if you've got a smorgasbord of things that you could eat, and there's a limited amount of each one, you're going to start with the stuff you like the best, and you're going to work toward the stuff that you don't like, right? But, and if we do that over a short period of time, we can get everybody, we can get more people fed, and they'll do just as well as we would if we spread that if we spread that out over a longer period of time. It starts off being great, but towards the end everybody's not satisfied, and you can end up eating the same amount, and in the first instance everybody is doing well. In the second instance they get to doing poorly. The other thing we can do by saying how long and how much country is available to those animals is we can teach them to eat things that they didn't even know were food previously. And so we can affect the learning that goes on. A lot of times we can increase, say we have naive animals that aren't from that part of the country. If we graze them in close proximity to animals that have been there for a while, they learn from the ones that have been there for a while, and they learn the new foods. Another thing we can do is manage productivity, plant structure, particularly if we're worried about wildlife. We can manage species composition by affecting the water cycle, the mineral cycle, energy flow, and then plant competition, cooperation, and recruitment. These are ecological processes that determine what it is that the country can produce. We manage the water cycle by how much plant cover we have and the root density and depth of rooting of those plants. Mineral cycle, we want to have rapid growth and then rapid decomposition of what gets left. Energy flow is basically how much green leaf do we have on every day of the year. And then competition, if an animal grazes one plant and not another, it has affected the competitive ability between those two. Plants also have cooperative relationships. We may have a legume species that fixes nitrogen that can share with a grass plant that does not, simply by the mycorrhizal fungi that grow between them. And then recruitment, if we have enough moisture to get new seedlings, we need to have animals not being on every one of them where they clip them off before they can really put down a root system and be able to survive. So all of those things we can affect with how we manage the animals. We've known for years that if we take too much leaf off of a grass plant, we're going to affect root growth. It's going to stop for a while and we may get shallower roots. And so that plant is going to be less effective in competing for resources below the soil surface. And it's going to become more likely to have a detrimental effect in the case of drought. The other thing we've known for maybe not quite as long, but for a number of years now, is for a grass to make a new tiller, the base of that plant needs to get some light in order to initiate that growth. And so if we don't graze some plants for an extended period of time, we shut off that light and we tend to get things like dead centers. We get rank vegetation that's standing without very much green coming through it. And so we need to have periodic defoliation, but we also need to let it grow and establish that leaf material. This is a photograph from a research paper from way back in the mid-50s. And what they did was grow these grasses in pots and defoliated them every 2 weeks at about the levels that you see there. And they found that, yes, you affect the root growth, and they found that on the average, most grass species, once you take about 50% of the leaf area, you really detrimentally affect that root growth. And so they came up with, stock where you take half and leave half. The problem with that is the cows never learned how to read, and they didn't know you're supposed to take half of each of the plants, and they end up grazing much like you see here quite often, where they have areas where they graze repeatedly and quite closely, and other places that they hardly ever touch. On the average, they're at about 50% defoliation, but some are getting defoliated excessively, while others may be getting defoliated not nearly enough. This is a slide of some cattle who had GPS collars, and they were keeping track of where they went on the landscape. In this particular instance, I'm not sure how they were managed, but this is not one great big pasture. You can see about the middle of the picture, there's a pretty distinct straight line between that area with a lot of green spots and to the left of it. That's a fence line, I'm pretty sure. In some instances, we can affect where the animals go. In other instances, they may go to the same places they always did. But how long they're there, we can affect, and in some instances, we can change where they go also. If we change distribution, we can increase grazable acres, basically. If we change the timing and the frequency of the defoliation, we can affect the ability of that plant to recover and still be able to compete with its neighbors. And so we can be conservatively stocked. In this case, we had 21 acres per cow on average if you looked at the entire management unit. But if you look at where the animals were, the effective stocking rate was about a cow to 8 acres, in which case, and I mean, I don't know if that was an excessive amount or not, but it's certainly much heavier than what you would think based on how many animals were there. If we look at the effects of defoliation, whether it's fire, whether it's mowing, whether it's grazing, whatever, whether if it's a hailstorm, the effects of defoliation on an individual plant are dependent on the frequency and timing of the defoliation. If we graze it frequently, even at a relatively moderate rate, we're going to have a much greater effect on that plant than we will if we do it one time. When it's grazed has an effect. If we're grazing it when it has already initiated a seed stalk, that's much worse than, for instance, if we graze it when it's dormant. And so that's going to affect how that plant reacts. The intensity of the defoliation, that's something that everybody thinks about. If you graze it off to an inch tall, we're certainly going to have a lot more of an effect than if we're grazing it 4 inches tall. But the big thing, I mean, animals have grazed that way for, since animals have been grazing. But the difference is, quite often they ended up moving on and then wouldn't be back for quite a while. If we have pastures that are continuously stocked, the animals at least have the opportunity to come back and graze the plant before it's recovered enough. And so we need to manage not just numbers, but when they're there too. The other thing on a landscape scale is we may be able to affect distribution. And where the animals go can determine how the plants in those areas actually react to defoliation. This is some data that we had from a demonstration that we did in South Texas in Medina County. These were 2 different ranches, same soils. They were about 3 miles apart as the crow flies. The top one was a man who, was well above average kind of a manager, had cattle in the pasture year round, moderately stocked, tried to leave quite a bit of grass, but was continuously having animals there. The guy on the bottom his graze periods were no longer than a week, was gone between 30 and 90 days, even during rapid growth, grazed a pasture about 3 times in a year. Same species growing in this particular pasture that we were looking at. And we looked at these different factors. The residual to the production, that first column there, we had some exclosure cages and we clipped inside those to get the bottom number that you see there, the 4550 or the 1900. That is what those areas would produce if they weren't, without the grazing. That way we knew what the annual production was. And then the top number was what we clipped outside the cages to see what was the degree of utilization, which would be that third column. You can look there and see that the top guy was still very moderately stocked. Less than 40% utilization. Guy on the bottom about 26. We took root cores down to about a foot deep and looked at we just took the soil out and then washed it over a window screen and weighed the roots that were left on top of the window screen. And you can see we had about 5 times the roots in the bottom guy versus the top guy. The bottom guy was running about half again as many cattle per acre, or was using about 2/3 of the acres per cow as the guy on top. Now, one of the interesting things about both those places, they were both better than most people in that part of the world. But the guy on the bottom didn't even own the cattle. He didn't really care if he had cattle or not. He had them there to manage the place for bobwhite quail. But he still was getting more production from the cattle than the other guy was. And over time, the other guy ended up changing his management to more closely reflect what the guy on the bottom did. So what I'm getting at with all of this ain't rocket science. It's simpler, but it's harder. And by that, what I mean is, if you're going to be a rocket scientist, you got to carry every calculation you do out to the 12th decimal place, because if you miss by a little bit traveling that far, you're going to miss what your objective is. But the thing about them is they are going through a vacuum. They are shooting at things that they know the velocity of. They know how fast the rocket is going. They know everything about it, and they can take it to that kind of precision. What we've got to do as grazing managers is take animals that are changing every day and match them up with plants that are changing every day. And we can't measure what either one of them are doing real precisely. And the way we do it is by changing the timing, the frequency, the average intensity of defoliation, the distribution of the animals, and the opportunity for growth before or regrowth after to affect how those desired plants perform. If all we're doing is moderately stocking and hoping for the best and letting animals go wherever they want to, we're not able to, about the only thing we can affect is the average intensity of defoliation, right? So how do we, what do we do to get where we want to go? We have to manage when, where, how many, how often, and how long those animals are allowed on any particular part of the landscape. In that way, we can change how the animals perform and how they affect the resource that they're on. Now that sounds good, and some people just really like that kind of a thing, and so they do it. But in a lot of cases, people say, look, I don't want to have to work that hard. I don't want to be moving animals that often. But there may be reasons to do it even for other things. And so that's what I want to talk about now. So for instance, if we're wanting to do a herbicide treatment, and herbicides, different herbicides kill different kind of plants. Sometimes, though, they're not selective enough. We may kill some non-target species that we'd really rather not. And so, for instance, if we're using something like 2,4-D that is a contact herbicide, we may be able to graze that area, decrease the leaf area of those desired plants, and make them less vulnerable to that herbicide. Now you'll notice I have may in capital letters there. To my knowledge, nobody has ever really looked at that as a management practice and how viable that is, but I think it's something to think about. But we do, I think we can say that we may be able to, especially for like individual plant treatments, make species that we want to control easier to see and to treat. For instance, if you've ever tried to do basal treatments, and you've got grass growing up around the base of those plants, it gets exceedingly difficult to do that. Sometimes there are plants that we can't see because they're down in the grass, and so we need to get to it. That can help too. Those sort of things may be a big deal. In some instances, because a lot of these herbicides are basically synthetic plant growth hormones, the increased growth that you see, for instance, with 2,4-D, makes some of those plants more palatable than they would be otherwise. And so we may be able to get out of a pasture while those plants are more palatable so that we don't get poisonous plant ingestion. By the same token, we may be able to use the herbicide and then use the animals to get them to eat a plant that they might not normally. And then the last thing is that on those desirable plants, we may be able to increase the rate of recovery once we put the herbicide out by decreasing the intensity of the defoliation on those preferred plants, and possibly if we can change plant selection, where animals learn that something is actually food if they want it to be. We may be able to use the animals to control the plants afterwards, where we don't get reinfested quite as quickly. In the case of prescribed fire, I think we can do a lot of things with the grazing management. One is, if we're using multiple paddocks per herd, we may be able to set aside a pasture to be burned without causing an undue amount of stress on the animals or increasing the stocking rate excessively in some of the other pastures, because it's just part of the rotation. And as we go around, we're giving it enough recovery where by the time we come back, we've burned it and it's still had a chance to recover. If we start doing that and we find out, this is really a lot drier year than we planned on, and we really don't want to burn, and we may be running a little short of forage, we've just built in a drought reserve anyways, and we can go ahead and graze that pasture and still have everything be just fine. Another thing is the type of burn that we want to accomplish. We may need a high level of a high amount and a great deal of continuity of the fuels, or we may want to have a patchy burn. We can do that by we can change that continuity and amount of fuels by the way that we graze the pasture. We may be able to go in and graze in fire breaks if we've got country that's too rough that we either don't want to plow in breaks or we just can't get to it. We may want to remove some leaf area from some plants that may make them more or less vulnerable to fire. And finally, we may be able to manage some of the escapes into surrounding vegetation if we graze those surrounding pastures or areas to down a little closer. We may be able to affect how likely we are to have an escape from that fire. This is an example. This guy, I am not a huge advocate of this kind of grazing management, but if I was wanting to burn that area that's still green, I think I could get that done and not be worried about having it escape somewhere else. Now, this guy was not particularly a burner. He would go in and graze an area like this to manage the brush composition and structure. And then he was gone from these areas for 2 years or more to let the regrowth come, and that was his brush management strategy. He got a forage resource out of it. Now, these were cattle that were adapted to this kind of management, but he was running much higher stocking rates with still adequate performance because he was grazing them to this level in less than a day and then moving on and then being gone for a long period of time. He had lower brush canopies and increased herbaceous response because of the way he was managing this. This was a wildfire situation. The place on the left burned. They had a lot of, I mean, they tried to manage water and have a lot of residual cover and that sort of thing. This fire burned so hot. This was actually a pretty tame part of that fire. You can see those junipers in the background. This was one of the places where they actually had some juniper residual left. In a lot of cases on this ranch, I mean, it just completely evaporated the juniper. It was so hot there were rocks that were cracking. The guy on the left, that was not, I mean, his place looked about that way most of the time. And you can see a fire going that hot got to that fence line and basically stopped. A year later, this is the exact same shot from exactly the same spot. The guy on the left is where it burned, the guy on the right is where it did not. And you can see we've got better cover, we've got better vigor on the left side than we do on the right. Another thing we can do if we have the infrastructure and the strategy in place, we can affect the recovery and the distribution of grazing following a fire. We may either want to be in right after the fire, or we may want to be gone for an extended period of time after a fire. And we have that flexibility to accomplish whatever the goal is that we want. Another thing that we can do with this sort of thing is have animals either a long way, most of the time, want to be a long ways from a fire when we start burning, just in case we have an accidental escape. We can affect a fuel load in the pasture so we can decrease the likelihood of an escape. We may want to have cattle close to a set of pens just in case there is an escape, that we can get them gone before the fire front gets to them. So all of those things can be a means or an advantage of doing this sort of a thing. How we manage all these processes, how we achieve these goals, there's 5 basic things. Stocking rate, that's going to affect average intensity. Stocking rate is something everybody thinks about, everybody understands pretty well. How many animals for a given period of time have access to a given amount of area. But again, that's basically what we can manage, is only the intensity of defoliation. Recovery period is going to affect when we graze those plants, how often we graze those plants, and what the opportunity is for them to regrow and recover between defoliations. In my view, that is at least as important as stocking rate and possibly more so. The number of pastures or paddocks that we have per herd is going to affect, again, when we graze, how often we graze, the opportunity for growth and regrowth between defoliations, and may, not necessarily always, but it may affect where those animals go and which plants they can eat while they're there. And then stocking density may or may not affect distribution, diet selection, and average intensity. It's not commonly well understood, but the analogy that I use, if we have a high stocking density, that is a lot of animals per unit of area, we're gonna increase the rate that we make the forage disappear. But we can stop anytime we want to and move on. It's the same way as if I leave at a place going 60 miles an hour and somebody else leaves going 30 miles an hour, who's going to go further? Well, it depends on how long each of us drive, right? So we may have an increased ability to select, a decreased ability to select, or the same ability to select based on how long we're there compared to how much the density has changed. And that's all I really have right now. If anybody has any questions, well, I would certainly take them at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Steffens. If you have any questions, y'all feel free to type them in the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner. In the meantime, while y'all do that, let me go ahead and mention that our next session is going to be January the 4th. James Jackson is going to be our speaker, and the topic is going to be improved pasture, weed, and brush management. And there's going to be one CEU IPM. If you're not doing so, you can follow us on Facebook. We post about twice a week. And if you can go to facebook.com/txrange, you can see our post there. We also take questions and what have you. So in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to send you to a web link. If you didn't get the browser pop up, you can simply click on this link here and you should be able to get the survey. Any questions, y'all feel free to type them out.